Is that me or the mic? Morning all and welcome to Economy Scrutiny on the 16th of November. I'll just kick straight off with the agenda, I think. We have an apology from Councillor Gwen Lowe from Kirklees, who's not able to make it. A couple of councillors have said they may be late, Councillor Brundale and Councillor Ahmed. Sorry, you are. So this is the other thing that I'll mention actually, that I noticed everyone's got their name things pointed towards me. I'm still not very good with all the names, so if I'm struggling to see them, just bear with me. So I recognise faces, but the names are a bit of a challenge for me, so bear with me and I'll try my best. But we are correct, which is good. So I think we're recording this as well. Are we recording this now?
Yeah.
So this is live, so thanks Hannah. So declaration of disclosable pecuniary interests. If anyone's got anything to declare, please would you make that known now? Take silence as a no, thank you. Number 3, possible exclusions of press and public. The majority of the meeting will be held in public and it will be live streamed. When we move to agenda item number 7, on adult education, if we need to discuss things within the appendix of the document on adult education, we will need to stop streaming at that point because there is some information in that cannot be held in the public domain. So we will cross that bridge when we come to it, and I've asked Phil and Hannah to remind me at that point, please, just in case we do veer into discussion of something that I shouldn't be doing in public. Okay, so number 4 on the agenda is minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of March 2022. And the reason these are on here now is because at the last meeting on 21st of September we were not quorate, so therefore we couldn't approve these minutes. So I'm not sure how many of the people on the list as being present in the meeting are actually here today, but you've all got a copy in your pack. I've read them and I'm happy with them. Are there any comments? Hello, Councillor Smith.
The right one. Yeah, my name's to be added to the list of people that were there, and I'm happy to approve them.
Thank you. Can we just amend the record to take account? Thanks, Hannah. So we'll sort that out. And then any other comments on the minutes of March meeting? Thank you. So notes of the incorrate meeting on the 21st of September. I don't know whether we need to approve these because it wasn't a quorate meeting, or do we just need to informally look at them and mention any comments that we may have? I think that's probably the way we should do this. So number 5, again I have read these. I'm not proposing to go through these line by line. So if there are any comments on this, please let me know. Again, I'm seeing silence, so I'll note that as everyone's happy. So, number 6 is my comments. I haven't got that many, to be honest, which you'll be pleased to hear. I'm pleased to see that we are quorate, so I'd like to thank everyone for making the effort to attend. I know we did actually write to people after the last meeting and mention how important this was, and I appreciate this is quite a long way to come for many of us, but it's good to see that we're all here and able to make this a formal meeting, because it is a really important thing to be able to scrutinise this authority. It's got a very wide remit with a very large budget, and so that's all I really wanted to say about that. I don't think there's anything else I needed to update you on that's happened since the last meeting that's not covered in the agenda proper. So at this point, on number 7, which is the main item of business for today, I will pass over to Phil, who is Director for Economic Services. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to ask everyone present. There are some new faces here, and I probably should have done this at the beginning. would it benefit people for us to just very, very quickly go around and say who we are? If you prefer not to, if there's not loads of nodding, I'm going to just assume we're all happy to proceed. Okay, we'll proceed. Okay, so Phil, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Morning, members. The whole session today is devoted to skills and the labour market and the adult education budget, which is a really, really important issue for our people, a really, really important issue for our businesses. Particularly when we speak to businesses, it's something we hear a lot about in terms of challenges in the labour market, challenges of recruiting. It's also worth knowing that, as I'm sure you're all aware already, that this has been a significant area of devolution when we did the devolution deal, and is pretty much our largest area of budget outside of transport. So a really important issue to us. So really pleased that we're devoting this whole session to talking about skills and our approach around skills. We've got four kind of sub-papers within this item, which I'll hand over to colleagues in a second, but just to introduce those broadly now. The first one is Peter's going to talk about labour market evidence and where the current evidence is saying, and evidence must drive our policy and what we do, so that's really important. Michelle is going to talk about what we currently do around young people, because we know that's something that lots of people are very interested in. And then Lindsay's going to talk about the adult education budget, what we've done in terms of devolving that, what we're learning, what we're experiencing, for a chance for you to understand that, ask questions. And then the colleague that was presenting the final item is away today, so I'm going to present on kind of what we might be doing next and how we're shaping that. So if it's okay, Chair, I'll hand over to Peter to do the first part of this overall pack.
Okay, thank you, Phil. In terms of the commissioning note we received, there were a sort of range of questions, specific questions in there. So what I was thinking in terms of this, in terms of my piece here, would be to give an overview, and then maybe I don't know, Chair, if you want to then go to the specific questions later in the session, or you'd prefer me to cover them during this introduction.
I'm happy with whichever way you prefer to do it, and I think that mostly members will write down questions and ask them when you finish going through the report, just however you feel comfortable, really.
Okay, fine. So in the commissioning note, there was a question about the available data and the extent to which it gives us a clear picture at local level. What I would say as a sort of introductory comment is there are limitations in terms of the data at local level, in terms of its timeliness and its level of detail. So in a number of cases, we do need to make inferences based on national data to get that really timely, detailed picture. So I think that is appropriate. So in terms of the cost of living crisis in the labour market, what is the data telling us? So what I would say, the overall picture is that the key labour market indicators don't show a severe impact at this point of time in terms of the cost of living crisis. And I think that situation could change quickly, and there is evidence to suggest that we're at an inflection point at the current point in time. So in terms of in terms of the kind of key indicators, if we look at the employee count, the number of people in employment, both nationally and locally, that is still growing. And also although the official employment rate is still below pre-pandemic levels. If we look at unemployment, the official count of unemployment, that's at historic lows nationally. So it's the lowest rate of unemployment since 1974. But that only tells part of the story around joblessness, which I'll come on to. If you look at the claimant count, the count of unemployed people who are claiming benefits in West Yorkshire, that has been falling since sort of early 2021, although it's been flat since the summer. But again, it's still higher than the pre-pandemic position. If we look at the redundancy situation and the potential for that to feed through, really we only have reliable statistics on redundancies at national level, but that level is still very low at the moment. It's not picked up at this stage. And the labour market is very tight at the moment, that's a key point. So vacancy levels remain close to record levels nationally, and if we look at online job postings in West Yorkshire, they're actually continuing to grow. So they continue to grow in October. So there's still strong recruitment activity. And sectors like hospitality still have a high ratio of vacancies to employment. So that's an important measure of the tightness of the labour market within that sector. Rates of pay are also growing rapidly in cash terms, we know from national data, and that reflects the labour shortage situation that we have. But because inflation is so high, actually workers are seeing real terms pay cuts at the moment, and that's particularly the case in the public sector. So although private sector pay is increasing year on year by around 7% at the moment, public sector pay is only growing by 2%. So when you factor the inflation rate of about 11%, you can see the impact of that on public sector pay levels. So I mentioned joblessness and unemployment. Although unemployment is at very low levels, we still have high levels of joblessness, and that's because one of the key issues are people leaving the labour force and becoming economically inactive. So recently we saw a record level of increase in the number of people who are economically inactive. It was the biggest quarterly increase since 1971 in people leaving the labour force. So in spite of the fall in unemployment, nationally we have 500,000 more people who are workless, either unemployed or economically inactive. We can't measure that very accurately at West Yorkshire level. So 3/4 of the people who've become inactive are older people. Plus we've seen a record rise in people who are inactive due to long-term health conditions. So we've got that underlying structural issue there. Now I mentioned before that it's probably the case that we're at an inflection point in the labour market. And one of the key sources of evidence that shows that is a quarterly economic survey conducted by Western North Yorkshire Chamber. And what that paints a picture of is rising costs within the business community. So not just rising utility costs, although utility costs, some businesses are reporting are 3 times the level that they were before the energy crisis, even factoring in government support. But manufacturers are also seeing high raw material costs, high transport costs, and of course high labour costs. In services, it's more utilities and labour costs rather than raw material, obviously. And what the QAS is showing is a slowdown in sort of recruitment intentions now. So employers are still reporting those recruitment difficulties, but their employment growth expectations are now softening, and that's because some of them are making the decision to make do with the existing staffing cadre that they have because of lighter order books and decreasing sales. And so their turnover and profitability expectations are falling. So that is at some stage going to feed through into the labour market. Now, one of the questions in the commissioning note was about people looking to change jobs. And one of the key stories at national level, because we can't replicate it at local level, is the high number of job-to-job moves that we've seen in the labour market. So as the economy was emerging from lockdown, there were 1 million people moving jobs every quarter, which is record levels. And since then, it's stayed at relatively high levels, close to 1 million per quarter. Very few of those people are moving due to redundancy. It's primarily people resigning and moving jobs for better opportunities. So we're still seeing that high level of sort of turnover within the labour market. In terms of people looking for work, and the situation around that was also mentioned in the commissioning note, as I referenced, claimant unemployment is still around 70,000 in West Yorkshire, and that's still significantly above pre-pandemic levels. It's been flat, the overall level's been flat since the summer, but a key point that we're seeing emerging now is the number of young people aged 16 to 24 who are claiming unemployment benefits is starting to grow. So that's grown about 2,000 or sort of 10% since June. So we are seeing that is one of the signs that we are seeing around the labour market softening. An important thing about the dynamics is that unemployed people, we've seen falls in unemployment in terms of the official measure. That's not solely due to people going into work. People are also leaving unemployment to become economically inactive as well. So that's another part of the sort of dynamics of that. And then we had a question also about retired people returning to work. So as I mentioned before, older people leaving the labour force is a key challenge, and it's a very dynamic picture again. So looking at the national figures, around 600,000 people moved from inactivity to employment in the most recent quarter. So it's not just people becoming inactive and remaining inactive. People are also coming back into the labour market. It's just that the number of people who are leaving the labour market is more than enough to offset the people who are rejoining. But what that means, based on the figures that we've developed, is the West Yorkshire labour force is probably about 35,000 people smaller than it was pre-pandemic. If we want to address the kind of shortfall of people in the labour force, taking into account long-term unemployed people as well as the inactive, we probably need to get 45,000 people into work in West Yorkshire. So that's a kind of overall summary of the sort of labour market situation. There were some other questions that were raised in the notes, but I think they're covered in the report as well. But I'm happy around career activity of young people, and I'm happy to come back to those as the sort of session progresses, if that's okay with you, Chair.
Thanks. So I think probably the best thing to do is take questions on this particular part of the agenda. If members want to, I think given the time, we'll probably try and divvy it up so that we've got an appropriate amount on each thing. So is there any comments or questions? Hi, Jeff.
Thank you, Chair. Think about the balance of the workforce, the employed workforce in our region. What are the relative proportions of people in public sector employment as compared to people in private sector employment? And are the challenges in both those different sectors the same, or are there different challenges in the different sectors?
So I'm trying to recall the exact sort of split between public and private sector employment. I think it's around sort of 20% public sector in West Yorkshire, but I would need to check that figure. But I do recall that the proportion relative to the national average is very similar in West Yorkshire, so we don't have a strong overrepresentation of public sector employment in West Yorkshire, which you often actually see in quite a few sort of weaker local and regional economies. In terms of the challenges, I mentioned the point about pay. So we do have the rate of increase in levels of pay within the public sector is a fraction of that's been seen in the private sector. So, but we also see, I mean, obviously the public sector is a kind of multifaceted element of the economy, including health, education. But I think a common factor between the public and private sector will be that issue around labour shortages. Those are still present, and issues around staff retention across both public and private sectors. And I think in the paper we highlight, particularly with reference to further education colleges and their ability to retain specialist teaching staff is a challenge. They don't have the scope because of other cost pressures to increase pay, and that affects, it's a double whammy in a sense that it affects their capability to actually develop the skills that are needed by the economy. So I mean they would be the main points that I would highlight.
Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Just thinking about those sectors of the economy that are finding it hard to recruit and retain, what evidence is there from the work you've done or in other regions, I guess, around the impact of Brexit in terms of either a reduction in the inflow of workers, but also a potential exodus of workers who were based in this country but have now gone. I just wondered whether there was any kind of hard or anecdotal evidence around the impact that's had.
So if you look at the sort of national analysis, first of all, the estimate is that around a third of the sort of labour force deficit that we're seeing at the moment is due to the sort of migration aspect and the people who were the sort of European migrants who were working in the UK no longer being available in the same numbers. So if you look at that deficit in the labour force, around a third is due to that, with the remainder due to older people leaving the labour force, and as I mentioned previously. So it has had a substantial impact, but is not the kind of main impact, arguably. If we look at the kind of jobs that EU migrants undertook in the economy prior to Brexit, and to some extent still undertake, a lot of those were lower skilled, sort of operative and what you would call elementary roles in sectors like warehousing, some elementary manufacturing roles. So you can see that there are issues in filling those posts, which is not disconnected to the fact that there are fewer people from sort of European Union migrants available to fill those roles. Actually, though, if you look at the employment figures, the number of migrants working in the UK economy doesn't seem to have changed all that much as well. So it is quite a complex picture, but certainly it has an impact on the people who are available. And manufacturers, for example, we know from anecdotal evidence highlight the fact that the lack of access to EU workers has impacted their ability to fill posts. So it is a significant contributing factor.
Thanks. Councillor Smith, Audrey?
Thank you. Just on the type of work, it sort of follows on a bit from that question. It's around the type of vacancies that have been that exist. Are they directly related to the people that have the older people that have left the workforce, or are they new vacancies that would suit the unemployed, the people that are currently unemployed, registered as unemployed? And also then just the other question was about, people are, we say that people are economically inactive, but a lot of people have left work, but they are volunteering, and that does contribute hugely to our economy, and I just wondered if any measurements around that have been done.
So I mean, first of all, around the vacancies and the kind of profile of vacancies, I think that when we think about labour shortages in the current labour market, in general, it's not really a skills deficit, it's a shortage of available people to do jobs. So if you look at the ratio of vacancies to unemployed people at national level, then there are 0.9 unemployed people per vacancy. So there are fewer unemployed people at the moment than there are vacancies. So it's an overall deficit of sort of personnel available to do the jobs. So that's a point I would make. And if you look at the profile of vacancies and where the growth has occurred since the economy reopened, a lot of those are lower skilled roles. So I think there's a slide in the pack that you've received that shows you that hospitality was the fastest growing area in terms of vacancy growth. So obviously it'd been locked down during COVID, and staff were required to sort of fill the gap. So a lot of the jobs that are available would be suitable for people who are unemployed claimants and maybe don't have a high skills base. But in addition to that, though, if you look at the areas that have grown most since before the pandemic, digital is a key area. So particularly sort of IT professional roles. So there is an element where we're saying higher skilled, there is growing demand for some higher skilled roles as well, with digital being a really important element of that. It predates the pandemic as well, but it's been accelerated, if anything, by the pandemic, and the demand is continuing to grow. So there are a number of sort of facets to it. Really, you've got labour shortages for a variety of roles, including sort of lower skilled roles, but you've also got continuing sort of what I would call skill shortages, where higher skilled technical roles are difficult to fill because the available candidates there aren't enough available candidates with the skills needed to do the job. In terms of the voluntary sector and sort of inactivity, I mean, I think that is important. It's not an area that we've actually looked at in a great deal of detail before, other than with in terms of work around the sort of voluntary sector. But I think there's actually work ongoing at the moment on that side, but I'm not really familiar with the details of that. So that's what I would have to say.
Thanks. I noticed you mentioned the hospitality sector. It's something I've asked about before, and it's something that does worry me a little bit. I don't know whether I'm overly emphasising this, but I see this as a fairly pivotal industry because it underpins a lot of things. As you know, we all understand if there isn't a hospitality industry, then there's a circular economy, isn't there? People go out and spend money in the hospitality industry, but you know, businesses. To me, I might be making more of it than there actually is, but I suppose I wonder if we come on to any of this in any other agenda items about 7B with the younger people, or there is another point as well I'd like to raise. You mentioned about taking up of apprenticeships well below pre-pandemic levels. That to me is something this authority could influence. So I don't know whether there's a really easy, obvious answer to why that is the case, or I suppose I'm not so worried about why it's happened. I'm more worried about what we do to change that, and what plans have we got to address that.
In terms of why it's happened, there was quite a big fall in terms of apprenticeship vacancies during the pandemic. That is actually recovering now. So if we look at the provisional figures for the latest academic year, we can see an element of recovery in the take up of apprenticeships now. Although I think the outturn when the final figures are published will show that there is still a bit of a deficit relative to sort of the pre-pandemic situation. And that's fairly obvious that in sectors like manufacturing, employers weren't really in a position to put out vacancies for young people, for example, to come into the workplace during that period because it wasn't suitable in view of the restrictions. So I think we're just in a recovery phase at the moment. The positive news is that the level of vacancies in 21-22, or the first half of the first half of 22-23 have been very strong. So a lot of apprenticeship vacancies are now out there. The question is whether they'll be taken up, and we'll see that reflected in apprenticeship starts. So that would be an overview of what the challenges have been, and I don't know whether any of you are picking those up in.
Yeah, please. I'm conscious we probably need to wrap agenda item 7A up fairly briefly, but yeah, I think that's important because I think it's something that is in the gift of this authority to do, and that's what we should be focusing on in scrutiny. But yeah, if we could cover that a little bit, yeah, please. I'm just going to take one more question. Councillor Pillai, did you, Chris?
Vacancies in relation to either what do you call manufacturing, or is it in the service sector?
So the areas where the subject areas with the highest levels of apprenticeship vacancies and apprenticeship starts are sort of health, public service and care, which is primarily sort of health and social care. Another big area would be engineering and manufacturing, and also I'm trying to remember the final area that I always it's amongst the top three. Yeah, construction's a big area as well. So there are a number of subject areas that account for a high proportion of apprenticeship starts, but it is spread across the manufacturing service economy. In terms of the sort of hospitality sector that we're talking about, that was quite hard hit by the pandemic. So there are around 350 apprenticeship starts in the latest year that we have data for, which is about half the number of starts that we're seeing pre-pandemic. So that gives you an example of the sort of impact as well. So yeah, it's quite a diverse range of subject areas, and also it varies according to the age of the apprentice. So young people tend to focus on particular subjects, and the levy funded older workers tend to undertake different subjects. So I think another key point to mention is the differing performance at the different levels of apprenticeships. So although intermediate and advanced apprenticeships have declined in recent years, there's been strong growth in higher apprenticeships. So they could be up to degree level, and a lot of those apprenticeships have been in management disciplines, for example, funded through the levy and focusing on people who are in employment already rather than recent recruits. So it is quite a complex picture in terms of apprenticeships.
You're looking at in the presentation pictures. People who need reskilling.
I mean, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, in terms of people who need it, it were probably people towards the older end who maybe need. But at the moment, we've seen that there are labour shortages. So in terms of labour market demands, there are opportunities even in areas where they're seeing longer term decline in employment. So if you're thinking about sort of semi-skilled manual roles, for example, or secretarial roles which are in long-term net decline in terms of the number of jobs, probably at the moment there will be quite a lot of opportunities available. But if we're thinking about longer term, the people who tend to be skilled in those areas and have an occupational background in those areas would tend to be older people, so 40 years and above. So that would tend to be, yeah, I mean, older, mature people. You've got to be careful here, haven't you? So I think that will be the main emphasis. But that's not to say that there aren't reskilling requirements across the board. So some younger people might want to make a career change. They may decide that they've invested in the wrong area and want to go into a different area. So it is quite complex.
Thanks. I'm pleased I've qualified as an older person for quite a few years now. Thanks for reminding me. Now, I did say I was going to close. I'm going to take one last, and this will be the last one. So, Councillor Almaz, please, briefly, if you would.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around the employment rate gaps amongst different groups. Do we have similar? It's quite interesting to look at the gaps actually, and in some cases we're well below the national average, if you like. I'd be very interested to look at some sort of equivalent data, if available, in terms of the qualifications and skills as well amongst various groups, and that could be sent to us later.
So we're actually about to publish Inequality, Diversity and Inclusion report, which includes, as well as looking at the employment rate gaps in a lot more detail, also looks at the qualification and attainment profile by ethnic group, for example. And it's quite a complex picture in that different ethnic groups perform differently on attainment. But in general, most ethnic minority groups perform better than the white group on a lot of the measures of attainment, including a Key Stage 4. But what we see in West Yorkshire, say, for Key Stage 4, is even though some of those groups perform better than the white group, they still underperform relative to the national equivalent national average performance for their group. So we still have a deficit there, even though the hierarchy is sort of similar to the national position. So yeah, we can certainly circulate that report, Charlie. You can look at that in more detail.
So, for example, come back, Chair. So, for example, in terms of ethnic minorities employment rate gap, when compared to England's percentage is 10% below that. So, I'd like to know more about that, if possible. Thank you.
So, I mean, just to briefly answer that is about sort of the specific composition of the ethnic minority group, because obviously that's a catch-all for a very diverse group of ethnic minority groups, and West Yorkshire's differs from the national picture, so that contributes to that deficit, I think it's fair to say. But the report I mentioned looks at that in more detail.
Thanks, all. Can we move on to agenda item 7B, which is programmes for young people? Not sure who's presenting that, Phil.
Michelle is presenting that.
Thank you for the reminder. We've been asked to focus in particular on young people's careers, which we understand is an area that you're particularly interested in. But I did want to put that in the context of our broader offer on employment and skills for people and businesses. So there's a summary at 2.6 in the paper that gives that complete picture. and that includes, of course, devolved programmes, but also, but the majority of the activity actually is externally funded, including through contracts with the Department for Education, the Careers and Enterprise Company, and of course DWP as the managing agent for European structural funds. And I think it's important to note as well that a lot of those funders have their own requirements. So at a regional level, it's really important that we're able to address both regional priorities and meet the funder requirements as well. So in terms of the context for young people in West Yorkshire, I won't repeat what Peter's said. Peter's gone into a lot of detail, including in the questions. But it's important to remember that the proportion of young people that are not in employment, education or training, so NEET young people in West Yorkshire, is higher than the national average and varies massively really across local authority areas, between 8% in Leeds to about 4% in the lowest area. So that is a high proportion really of young people that are not in education, employment or training, or that we're not actually able to say where they are. So there are a significant proportion of young people whose destinations are currently unknown. And it's important to note as well, we've just had a question about different demographics and people's destinations. It's really important to note that young people who've got special educational needs and disabilities and have got mental health needs are by far the most likely to be not in education, employment and training. And of course that in common with the rest of the country, young people's understanding and that of their parents and carers, that their understanding of the job opportunities available on their doorsteps and how to access them continues to be pretty poor. People's understanding of what their prospects are and realistically what the kind of information that Peter's been sharing with you about how our labour market is made up, people don't really understand that very well. Of course, the majority of funding for young people's education is not devolved. It's national via the Department for Education. That includes funding for schools, 14 to 18 provision in colleges and apprenticeships funding. Those are all completely centralised and national with no level of local or regional influence. And our very important role locally, both in the local authorities and the combined authority, is largely around careers, helping people understand their labour market, what's distinctive about West Yorkshire, inspiration, particularly for those disadvantaged groups and communities, employer engagement, where there is a proven link between young people's destinations and the meaningful interaction they have with employers while they're in education. And employment, so supporting the employment destinations of our young people in West Yorkshire. So around apprenticeships, we've had this question earlier today. Our role is largely around demand stimulation for apprenticeships. So we're not in while we're not in control of the funding, we've got a really important role in encouraging employers to offer apprenticeships, reducing barriers for employers in offering apprenticeships, so helping them through the bureaucracy and supporting them with the funding. So apprenticeship funding is complex, but one of the things we're doing in West Yorkshire is we're supporting large employers who have to contribute to an apprenticeship levy if their pay bill's over £2 million. We're supporting them to keep unspent levy in the region by supporting SME apprenticeships. So it's a really important role around demand stimulation, but also in terms of that careers and awareness, helping people of all ages from all backgrounds understand the opportunities that apprenticeships offer. So in terms of our offer for young people, it's predominantly covered by the following 4 areas, which are summarised in the paper. Firstly, our all-age careers platform, which is called Future Goals. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's amazing. I'd encourage you to have a look at it. It's got huge reach, over 3 million in the last financial year. That is largely through careers and education professionals. So it's really, really well used in schools and in universities actually, and by people that advise people about their careers, because as to help overcome that challenge that people really don't understand at the moment, the career opportunities available to them. The second area is employment support. So the Employment Hub and moving to a new Employment West Yorkshire programme next year is really focused around the issue that Peter was talking about the size of the labour market. What we're trying to do is to increase the size of the labour pool by supporting people from all backgrounds into employment. So that's delivered through local authorities. So far, over half of the people supported have been younger, have been aged 15 to 24. And one of the underpinning design principles really around our employment support is that it's really flexible, because at the moment we're wrestling with a challenge that's about a labour shortage. So we're trying to support more people into the labour pool, but the programme is flexible so that if that employment picture changes, as Peter was alluding to, there's a lot of uncertainty about future trends. If we do see an increase in employment, we're able to flex the offer to respond to a change in the kind of client base and people that need to be supported. The third area is around partnership with schools. And as a combined authority, this is actually our longest running employment and skills offer. So we've been working with a network of secondary schools and colleges for about 7 years, which you'll know in a landscape of often changing initiatives is quite a long time. So we've now got we're working closely with 185 secondary schools and colleges, which is practically all of them on our patch. There's only a couple that we don't work with. And we support those schools to make progress towards good careers benchmarks to improve the destinations, particularly of our most disadvantaged young people. And in particular, we ensure that young people, particularly those most disadvantaged, have got the opportunity to have meaningful engagement with employers. And through the pandemic, that was really important, because we were able to provide that virtual engagement with employers. So that we're not aiming to mitigate the negative impact on our most disadvantaged young people. And then the final area that I wanted to highlight was particular specific activity to support young people with special educational needs and disabilities due to their disadvantage in the labour market. So in particular, the Mayor launched a toolkit, I think a couple of months ago now, time flies, to encourage employers to offer work experience and employment opportunities to young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Employers can be really nervous about doing that and unsure about what it means for them, what practical things they might have to put in place. So we're really pleased that we've got a toolkit in place, a really practical toolkit in place to support employers. And we've worked with the Burberry Foundation to offer grants specifically to special educational needs and disability schools, and we've got a full evaluation in place around that.
Thanks for that. I'm going to take a question in a minute, but I'm just going to go first and be Chair's prerogative and be greedy. Really pleased with what you said there. It was a good report and a very nice summary. I'm a little bit worried about the NEETs. I don't like that acronym, but I'm a bit worried about it in a way, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, but we seem to be, as a region, collectively, behind where we need to be with this, and there are a number of factors, and you've addressed some of them, and there are some positive steps being taken. On the backdrop of a skill shortage, this looks like a win-win to me. If we've got a skill shortage and we've got loads of people that are not in education or training, there's a natural fit to address both issues. But we need to find out why these people and these young people are in the position they're in. Is it as a result of a larger proportion of special educational needs in the region? I don't know the answer to that. It might be. I don't see why there would be more people in that position in this region. But is it a factor? I don't know. You've mentioned things about employer engagement, which I think is absolutely key, really critical, and we've talked about this at this committee before, about related to universities offering the correct places for local industry, but this is more about employers offering apprenticeships, I think, and we've touched on that a little bit, and I think we need to focus on that again. and engagement with employers, not just through schools, but about workshops and things like that. This is really important, and I know you've mentioned it, and the authority's clearly doing something to address this, but we have to take this seriously, because this is it's pretty stark, really, the percentage, because this is a small cohort of people as well, isn't it? But this is the future of our workforce and our industry and our economy, isn't it, that we're talking about here? And if there's a large percentage of people, for whatever reason that is, are either not able to or not willing to, or whatever the reason is, to engage with education or training, we must be able to do something and I'm saying we, I don't mean the people in this room, I don't necessarily mean the West Yorkshire Authority, I mean the whole region. It includes the whole gamut of politicians, educational employers, whatever, parents even. I'm a parent, my kids would be kicked down the road well before they became sitting in the house at 16. That might be a factor, I don't know. But what's your view on all of that? Sorry to lump a hell of a lot of stuff on you, but
Yeah, that's quite a big question, or a number of questions. So firstly, on the proportion of NEETs, as a combined authority, we're really keen to support and work with our local authorities on their statutory responsibilities around NEETs, and it's a really I think that's a really good example of where kind of the convening opportunity can really make a difference, and there are quite different approaches taken across different local authorities around discharging those statutory responsibilities. So I think that you're absolutely right that that's a really important area. I guess one of the factors is, of course, that as a region, we do have a higher proportion of young people. We've got a younger population than other areas, and so I think some of our local authorities have got a big challenge there in terms of addressing that. But that's also a strength, isn't it? So that's our future. Young people are our future talent pipeline. That's crude language, but we've got a real opportunity to kind of harness that potential and work together to address that. But I would also, you made a really important point, and I think I should have included that in my report, that actually we are working with, I focused on the report about engagement between young people and schools and employers. And actually, we have got a significant programme of work which supports employers to engage with the full breadth of the education system, because actually, while we're really fortunate that through the Careers and Enterprise Company, we've got a significant amount of resource that enables us to bring it to deliver with secondary schools. Actually, employer engagement at all stages of the education system has that an impact on destinations, right from primary through to postgraduate. And there is a real appetite from employers to engage. Where they don't engage, or where they don't engage as much as we'd like with education, it's largely due to a lack of understanding about how, and perhaps being blinded by different ways of engaging with the system. So we do have a fantastic programme in place that supports employers to understand the system and figure out the best way for them to engage, dependent on their priorities. But you're absolutely right that engagement through secondary schools is only one way, and actually employers need to engage with the full breadth of the education system, and we as the public sector and education need to make it easy for them to do that.
thanks. Yeah, it was a comprehensive answer and reassuring, and I think your point about being a large number of young people is quite key. But they are the future, and it's absolutely critical we get this right. So, if one takeaway from this meeting is just, let's carry on focusing on that. In less than 10 years, I'm going to be a retired person. I need these young people to be paying the taxes to pay for my lifestyle and my pension and my health care and whatever else I'll be enjoying. Next question is Councillor Firth, Sam.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I just wanted to come back on particularly the Future Goals website, because I actually think this item itself could be an entire item on its own if we were to drill down into the detail. I think it is a fantastic headline figure of 3.2 million, but actually to understand what it's being used for ultimately is critical, because the biggest thing, a part of particularly we're looking at here, is the fact that we've also got a lot of money coming through in terms of added skills, and it'll be interesting to see as a result. Yes, if we are having at one end a lot of engagement through young people, through schools and looking at their options for the future, are we then neglecting something that we are receiving a lot of funding for to be able to then make sure that those courses are going through? I do know from my own, don't know whether and how, but I was receiving a lot of Facebook advertising over the summer in particular for adults training courses, and I think that ultimately it'd be interesting really to see potentially the future chair looking at actually how really that website is being used and who is using it the most, and is there anything that we actually need to continue to do to ensure that people can use it, because actually that engagement was over the summer, when actually now I do most of the courses are online learning and could be picked up any time of the year. So I just wondered really, do you have any further meat on the bone that you could give in terms of exactly the nature of who's using the website, and also more generally whether that could be something that we could look in the future? Thank you.
That is a really good question, and I think we're trying to do quite a lot through Future Goals. I think having an all age careers platform is quite an ambitious thing, and we continue to evaluate that, and in particular our route to engagement with adults, because you're absolutely right. You know, that adult skills provision is huge across development. I'm not. Lindsay's going to come on to it, so I'm not going to say too much. But you know, you're absolutely right. We've got a lot of adult skills provision, and it's really, really important that we develop and continue to refine and try and innovate different routes to engagement, particularly to really improve our reach to different communities and to people that need that provision. So the honest answer is that we want to keep learning on that front. That, you know, and that is a new area. You know, we've only just finished the first year of the devolved adult education budget, and we want to keep trying different ways of reaching people. In terms of young people's careers, we've got a far more established track record, and it's a proven route to engagement with careers professionals. We know who they are. Trying to reach adults who might need to retrain or upskill is much harder, isn't it? So we want to try and reach them through different routes. And I'd say an online platform can only ever be part of that. But yeah, I totally agree with you. We need to we do have a really good plan in place to keep evaluating Future Goals, who it reaches, which parts of the site get the most traction, and that probably gives us the best illustration of who's using it. But you're right, it could be a whole meeting.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I know that it's very early on, but I think really to evaluate the success of actually what we're doing is really critical. Especially, I don't know whether this would be possible, but even if we could get into the detail of working out roughly geographically what the spread through, I appreciate that it could be done, but whether actually we have the data is another matter, and how we're collecting the data of the users that have gone onto our website. And I think the really interesting point is because of the spread in which, as a Leeds City Councillor, compared to some of my colleagues from across the rest of West Yorkshire, may have a totally different experience. And I think that certainly that would be something that if you could look into in the future, would it be possible? Or is that something you're not collecting data on, even when it comes to the kids and where they are at school and who's using the website?
So, our data on some of our resources is better than others, because we can put more. So, absolutely around the schools, yes, we can get quite good level of data because we can put more capture in. Obviously, the more requirements you put for people to input information about where they are, who they are, the less likely they are to engage. So, we probably know less about our adults, because or our kind of organic engagement, because you don't want to be putting barriers in place. When you're talking about careers professionals, yes, we do know where they are, we know who they are, we know where they are because they're willing to input that. It's more professional data, isn't it? So we have a good understanding of the way it's used in educational institutions, and therefore the reach.
Very quick.
Can we keep it very brief, because we've got to move on shortly. There's other people waiting to answer.
The reason I asked the question is simply because of the fact that we know that 3.2 million people are using the website, and I would just appreciate to understand if we're doing any evaluation to find out where they actually are from, rather than people physically putting that information into the website. But we don't need an answer on that, I don't think.
Thanks. Sorry to cut you off. I just want to move on to the next item in about 3 minutes, and we've got 3 people asking questions. Tyler, do you want to crack on?
Thank you, Richard. Just a couple of questions I want to ask mainly on the engagement in the schools. So good career benchmarks when you're working with the schools. Now, from my understanding, forgive me if I get this wrong from the conversation we have with our local schools, that schools themselves decide how much they invest in career guidance and career advice. Now, with the sort of financial pressures schools are under at the moment, there may be a sort of desire to, let's not invest in sort of the careers guidance, let's invest more in sort of the actual day-to-day spending that's required in the school. And also as well in the school that I went to, they were sponsored by the Russell Group of Universities. So they had an incentive to encourage children to go down that avenue rather than potentially going down an apprenticeship route. So I'm curious as to the interactions you do have with the schools, and on the sort of in terms of the apprenticeships and the pay for the apprenticeships as well that apprentices do get. That's a big thing for me as well. I'm wondering how much on average they're getting paid. Are they getting paid the minimum, or are they getting paid a little bit more? Because sort of a genuine appeal in sort of our area, we have a big problem with crime in the ward that I'm in, and I wish this was some sort of anecdote, but it's a proper conversation about where they can earn more money doing criminal activity than they can do an apprenticeship, and that's a draw for them there. So I'm just curious as to how much your financial support that employers are getting and what's being offered to the young people taking apprenticeships. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take that in 2 parts, if that's okay. So, schools and careers, Ofsted's a really big part of this. So the Ofsted framework now does give more, I'm not an expert in Ofsted, but does give more consideration to destinations and the impartiality of the advice that young people are getting. And that is having a big influence on the behaviour of schools in terms of the way that their openness to engaging with apprenticeships, because you are absolutely right that it's been really difficult, particularly with some schools and in some geographical areas, to get apprenticeships on the radar, and particularly with higher attaining young people. Actually, often apprenticeship providers and FE colleges have been really prevented from accessing those young people. We are seeing that behaviour change, largely due to the change in the Ofsted framework. What's measured is what happens, right? So that is having an impact, but you're absolutely right that the cost pressures that schools are under are perhaps impacting on how careers education is delivered in schools, and sometimes it's an add-on to a teacher's role, not necessarily a specialist. And I think that's why our work to help people understand the West Yorkshire labour market, to kind of take Peter's information and translate it for education for teachers is really important, because teachers aren't experts in the local labour market necessarily. So we're helping them to gain that information so they can give that advice. On apprenticeship pay, unfortunately, the minimum wage for apprentices is below the national minimum wage, and that is undoubtedly a factor in why demand from people of all ages for apprenticeships in a tight labour market has dropped. And I think a really important part of all of our role needs to be to encourage employers to pay a fair wage for apprenticeships.
Thanks. Right, we need to move on. So we've got 2 more questions from 2 more members. If we just make that the last, and the next one is Councillor Ahmed.
Thank you. Just a bit curious about a term that you used at the beginning of your presentation. You said young people, destination unknown. Now, that's going to be up there with hard to reach and people not engaging, because I just don't understand what you mean by destination unknown. can you just explain? Have they just disappeared off the face of the earth? Are they just no longer on anybody's books anywhere? Are they not signing on, reaching out? What's going on? I mean, what do you mean by that term? And I do agree with Councillor Hawkins with regards to careers. There's not enough careers days happening at schools. I've just recently retired from the health service, and I think over the past 25 years, I can count on one hand how many times we've been requested to come to school to talk to people about engaging with the health service, with emergency medicine especially. I made it a point, not last year and the year before, to make sure that from year 8 to year 11, all young people were engaged, not just year 11 because they're going out of school soon. And I think it's quite important that all year ranges are brought into these careers days, not just, you know, those that we know are going to go do their A-levels and go off and do whatever they want to do, but everybody. So, I mean, if you can just explain to me what you mean by young people destination unknown, please.
So, local authorities have a statutory responsibility to report on the destinations of young people, and there are a proportion that they're not able to identify where they are, and that proportion varies hugely across the country, and to some extent comes down to how local authorities have resourced that area of work, but comes down to kind of the demographic as well. It is hard to engage with some particularly disadvantaged groups. That is purely what it is. But it is really important that we understand, because actually that's how we need to understand the circumstances that people are in order to put the support in place for them.
Sorry, just as an addition, how do we know not where they are? I mean, surely somebody will know where they are. They have to be. If they're not working, they're claiming. So if they're claiming, there's a record of them. If they're not claiming,
no, that's a really, really important point that you raise, actually. And Peter talked about inactive people. So there are a significant proportion that are not available to the labour market. So who are not claiming, you're absolutely right. If people are claiming benefits, we know where they are. But if people are not in education, not in employment, not in training, and not in receipt of benefits, it is hard to know where they are. So that's exactly the point. And the point that you make a really important point about the age of young people that get access to careers, information and engagement with employers. And we completely agree that needs to start far earlier. And actually in the earlier days of our intervention and what we were funded to do with schools, it very much was in those last couple of years. We're really, really pleased that as the years have gone on, we've been able to make the argument to intervene far earlier, because it's much too late, isn't it? So many, and I think you could argue that secondary is too late as well, because young people have already written off a lot of potential career opportunities, sometimes along the lines of kind of gender stereotyping. But also if they've not had access to different opportunities. So I'm glad you made that point about intervening earlier.
Thank you. I think it is a really important subject, and I don't want to do it any disservice by closing this early, but this will be the last question. I think perhaps we need to come back to this as well at a later point. Councillor Smith, Audrey, the last question on this agenda item, please. And if we do get a chance at the end, if we can skip through any of the other things, we can possibly revisit, but thanks.
Thanks. On 2.39, when you're talking about the female participation in concentrated areas and the take-up from minority groups, what can we actually do about that? And also, I suppose, in relation to what's been said about disadvantaged groups not accessing apprenticeships, can you say, and also I think it's important to say how low the apprenticeship wages, because I know when my son went in to take an apprenticeship, I lost any child benefit for him, so the household income was down and he had a very, very low sort of wage coming in. So I mean, and he had transport costs on top of that, which weren't, recuperated. Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is about the further education colleges. They are really struggling, and I'm wondering, it says on 2.41 that the increase in number of people needing further education is going to be increasing, but I'm just worried about the financial sort of viability of FE colleges as we move forward, because I think all of this is great, but we are in a recession, and I think it's not really coming across the completely dire strait a lot of people are finding themselves in. Thank you.
Okay, so the first point you made was around apprenticeship take up and kind of gender stereotyping, really.
Yeah.
And that is really, really strong in apprenticeships, and it effectively means that women take up predominantly low pathways into lower paid occupations than men and boys do through apprenticeships. So I think it links back to the point that was just made about engaging earlier in education, because that's really, really pronounced in apprenticeships. You made a point about apprenticeship pay, and it's well made, and you're absolutely right. The apprenticeship, the minimum wage for apprentices is very low, and it is perhaps a driver of why people from disadvantaged backgrounds and poorer backgrounds are less likely to take up apprenticeships, probably because they need the support of parents for transport, because it's way below the living wage. So yeah, that apprentice pay issue is a really important one. You've then raised the issue about the stability of education and training providers, and that is something we're hearing a lot about, both from the independent training provider sector, so apprenticeship providers largely, but also our FE colleges. I think Lindsay might mention it in the AB paper, but we are being, that our FE colleges are making a really strong case that through devolved funding we should be looking at an uplift to the unit rate effectively, because that for adult skills funding, because that hasn't changed for 10 years. But we do need to remember that actually our funding, so devolve, we regionally are in control of the minority of. We regionally are in control only of a small proportion of the funding of those institutions. The vast majority is national, so apprenticeship provision, 14 to 19 funding is all that's all set nationally. But there is the smaller proportion that we are in control of, and locally and regionally there is the opportunity potentially to make some changes there.
Thank you. And we are going to move on to 7B. Before we do that, Phil's got a very brief comment on 7A, and then he's going to hand over to colleagues to present the report for 7B. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah, just in response to Councillor Ahmed's very good question and points, particularly on the careers advice point. I think one thing that's, aside from all the excellent comments that Michelle made on the skills response, I think one thing that we, as a kind of system and as a combined authority, and a local enterprise partnership, we need to get better at is utilising the 828 hours of private sector time we have through our private sector members. So where we have done things with private sector members, aside from kind of some of the challenges on careers funding that we've talked about already, it's been quite successful. So thinking kind of in your patch, Bradford Manufacturing Week, which we support as well. Things like that we're interested in, and for the groups we're talking about inclusion, that kind of thing around having confidence and connections, that they see people doing those jobs, they see that themselves as doing those jobs is important. So that exposure to the private sector and the public sector where possible for those jobs is really, really important. So I just wanted to say that aside from kind of the general skills work, that connection to the private sector and some of our partners is something there is an onus on us we are doing, and we need to kind of think about when we're delivering things. And I think I'm handing over to Lindsay now, which is probably the largest item in terms of spend, which is the adult education budget. So, Chair, we might want to spend a little bit longer on this than the next item. But
we do need to finish at 12 on the dot, and we've got a couple of brief agenda items to finish beforehand with respect to the future work programmes, etc. But I'll do that in 2 minutes. So, yeah, crack on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So the paper outlines, I suppose, as briefly as possible, the adult education budget, which can be accused of being overly technical. So I am going to try and keep the summary as helpful and illuminating as possible. We've had the devolved adult education budget now since August 2021. So we've just finished our first year of devolution. And within that first year was £65 million worth of funding to support adults. So as is, I suppose, the theme of many conversations already held so far, the AEB is absolutely an underpinning fund in terms of adult education, but it is a component part of that wider skills system that supports adults, which includes apprenticeship funding, adult learner loans, it includes higher education loans, to an extent private, personal and company investments in adult training as well, and other funds that specifically tackle certain economic issues that we see, previously the European Social Fund, in the future UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and some of the gain share aspects we have as well. But that said, it is a large amount of money, as we said, £65 million per year, very much focused on tackling low-level adult skills and then connecting people into employment. So within the paper, we've outlined the main funding components. The majority of that 65 million is paid on formula, and it is sort of per learner, per qualification, and it funds things like a traditional program you would expect to see in an FE college, maybe a year-long program that supports people into their career in the health and social care industry, in construction, into ICT, business accounting, art and media, so it's sort of very traditional adult programs that you would anticipate seeing. It also funds a range of courses that connect people directly into the vacancies, some of which Peter has mentioned in his earlier presentations. So things like warehousing, care roles, hospitality. In West Yorkshire, we also have programmes that connect to telecoms jobs, rail engineering, bus driving. So there are some quite short programmes which are focused at that reskilling and at giving people, I suppose, a second opportunity at their adult education. A lot of the funding, and you'll have seen in the data pack that I won't reference specifically, is about preparation for work. So some of that is really connecting the people with the lowest level skills in our area, they're developing their confidence, developing their ability to write a CV, to attend interviews, the behaviours that they need to turn up for a 4-day or a 5-day week. So a lot of that preparation to work is delivered through AEB, and of course the basic skills needed for employment: English, maths, digital skills, and in particular individuals who speak English as a second language, supporting them with English language skills in order to, again, to connect them into employment, but also to support them in their life in society and to integrate into West Yorkshire. So those are the types of the programmes that Adult Education Budget funds. Through the funding, we prioritise and we give sort of a higher weighting to certain things. Some of them are entitlements that are set nationally, but they are very sensible, so we wouldn't seek to overrule them in West Yorkshire. It's things like getting people their first GCSE or their first A-level equivalent, people who fundamentally have been let down by the educational system in their earlier life, and this gives them as an adult the opportunity to get those skills. And there's also entitlements for English and for maths to a GCSE level, and equally for digital skills. We also weight funding to make sure that individuals who are unemployed and seeking work, or people who are on a low wage, and equally individuals who are living in a disadvantaged area, the funding is weighted towards those individuals to make sure that more support is put in place to connect them to employment. So we mentioned in the paper that's sort of £46 million of that funding is spent in that area. Another substantial chunk of funding for the adult education budget is spent on community learning, which is an incredibly flexible pot. It's mostly, it's entirely delivered through our local authorities and through our FE colleges, who, within their role as public organisations, are very much place shapers and trusted organisations. As I say, it's very flexible, and again, a lot of that is about really reaching out to the most disadvantaged individuals who are just not yet ready for a traditional learning programme. Some interventions might include, for example, family learning, touching on points made earlier about supporting parents and how they might support their young people, possibly with numeracy, possibly with maths, possibly with their aspirations as well. So that is, I suppose, because it is quite flexible, we have less data and information on it. We are undertaking a review at the moment and understanding
more about the impact of that funding and what we've seen it achieve in year one. And that should be published in, we're hoping for January, February time, so that we can really understand the impact of that funding and hopefully shape a little bit more of how it's used moving forward. So I think it's important, as well as recognising that adult education budget is a component part of the skills system, it is important for us to remember that it did exist before devolution. It's always been a fund that's been available to adults. Really, the excitement of devolution is the fact that we get to see it, we get to manage it, we get to understand what is being delivered in the area, and we have that direct relationship with the providers who are putting the provision across West Yorkshire. And we have the ability to change the rules, we have the ability to make things more flexible or to prioritise the places in which we want to see the funding spent. So we set out our strategy, which was consulted on in 2020, which outlines our priorities for funding. We set aside some fund for responsiveness and for growth, which we have used in year one, and I'll come on to that in a second. Part of our role in devolution was also, though, to maintain an element of stability in the sector, and I think that's really important when we're thinking about the financial difficulties that some of our training providers are seeing. As much as we do want to, we see behaviours that we want to shape from the adult education budget, and we might want to make changes. We do need to understand that fundamentally, this 65 million has habitually supported. For us, around 46,000 learners per year to gain the skills they need for employment and skills. And before we take any seismic actions, we really need to understand it first before we make any to make sure that, I suppose, there aren't any implications of the changes that we make that aren't expected. That said, we have made a number of changes in year one. So, for example, we increased the low wage threshold from national living wage to real living wage, which meant that more people who had lower incomes in West Yorkshire were able to access free training. We expanded the age of entitlement. So previously, to get your first GCSE equivalent, you had to be between the age of 19 to 23 to qualify, and we thought that fundamentally that's incorrect, and it should be at any age. You should be entitled to that first GCSE equivalent, so that's one of the entitlements that we've changed. We provided full funding for eligible asylum seekers, so really aiming at opening up the funds to those who need it the most. In terms of commissioning, we also, we mentioned that part of the benefit of devolution is really having that clear visibility of what's being provided. Pre-devolution, we had about 200 training operators operating in West Yorkshire, some delivering very small pots. We now have 38, and we have a direct management relationship with those providers. And we can see from sort of the monthly conversations that we have with them, the data that we share with them, they can see that we're watching how the funding is being spent, and that is really helping to shape where the funding is being spent. We can see that there's an increase in individuals who are being supported from disadvantaged areas. We can see an increase significantly in ethnic minority participation from year one to pre-devolution. Peter, my esteemed colleague, is presenting to us at the end of next week a big bumper data pack on what we've achieved in year one, and that will be assembled into a year one report for us to reflect on, which we will absolutely share with the committee. But we can see early positive messages as to what we've achieved with the funding so far and how it is targeted. We've also trialled a few different new programmes or ways of working. I mentioned the bus driver training scheme that we commissioned. We've also expanded the amount, what's called the digital entitlement, so really helping people connect to courses that can improve their digital skills, which we know is a huge issue in terms of connecting people to employment. We're also looking at things like bridging programmes, supporting people from making that step between GCSE and A-level equivalent, and because we do need to push towards those higher level skills as well. So as part of that, I suppose, as part of that end of year reflection on the first year, we will be reflecting, I suppose, on the impact of the funds full stop, So that's about saying, well, 46,000 residents have been upskilled, 63% of those weren't in work, 41% of them were from the top 10 most deprived areas in West Yorkshire, 57% of participants were from a non-white ethnic minority, which is a real change from the West Yorkshire demographic. 65% of participants are female, which again, females have lower skills in West Yorkshire. So we will be looking at what the fund has achieved, full stop, for residents, but also the second lens is really how have we changed the behaviour of the funding from pre-devolution to now in the devolved state. Now we have more control over it. And ultimately, what are the next challenges that we need to be tackling in year 2 and year 3 and onwards? We've supported an element of that stability in the system in year 1. We've still made plenty of changes and hopefully they've been positive, but part of that end of year evaluation is really about seeing the areas that still need more work for us and working out how we can tackle them through adult education budget.
Thank you, Lindsay. I take it that pause is a finish. Cool.
Yes.
So, I have got a question, but I'm going to go to the back of the queue, to be fair, and if there's time. I'm going to extend this item to about 11:40, which will give us time to do 10-12 minutes on the last 7D, and then just wrap up the meeting. So, Tyler, you're first.
Thank you, Richard. Mine's quite a straightforward one, really, in terms of the allocation and how that's come to. Because looking at it, Kirklees gets a tenth of what Leeds does in terms of the allocation funding. Is there a reason for that?
So when we received the funds from government, a lot of analysis was done as to how the funding was spent, and adult education budget has always been, I suppose it's been demand-led as opposed to targeted on need. So one of the things that we set out in the strategy is that we would protect the amount of funding that was allocated to each local authority area. That said, the other point that we have laid out in the strategy is that we do need to I suppose shift that lens from what's the historical use of that funding in the area to what is a need, what is the need of the area, and how do we potentially retarget or refocus the funding moving forward. So in year 1, because of that, I suppose, the strategic outline, but also a demand from DFE to maintain some stability in the sector, we protected the values in each local authority area that was flowing into it, but we have committed to work with our local authority colleagues and also watching some of the methodology that's being worked out through DFE and through DWP about the distribution of funds across the areas, and I suppose to address exactly what you're pointing out, make sure that we're not just inheriting the proportions that were used before, but we're actually properly targeting into the areas of need.
Mike, just to go on the back of that real quick, how quickly will that happen? Because I've seen sort of next year's allocation it's all in line with the first year, but the allocation for the previous year as well. How quickly will that catch up?
So there are 2 ways of tackling it, and one is that we have our grant providers, we have our local authorities, our colleges, who have their specific allocations for their institution, but they're not actually bound to spend that on learners from their local authority. So part of the conversations that we're having is, for example, with our FE colleges. For example, why is so much of your funding being spent not on residents from the local authority that you're situated in? For some, there's a really clear reason for that. For others, we maybe need to have that strategic conversation about how they invest the funding that's coming to them into their local authority area. Another way to tackle is this. We have the grant providers, but we also went through to open and competitive tendering with private training providers. We have a much clearer relationship with those providers, where we can say we would like this provision to be delivered in X area. It's a lot faster for us to, I suppose, switch provision from a local authority where we can see a high percentage of engagement and a higher proportion of funding into another one. that is exactly what a number of emails in my inbox are talking about in terms of end of year one analysis. And because the other thing is, we can allocate, as I've sort of said, we can allocate funding to organisations where they then sort of deliver it. We operate on the premises that this is about learner choice, and it's about, we wouldn't ever want to turn a learner away who's trying to engage with education. So we wouldn't want to be in a position saying to a training provider, you can only support people from Kirklees, you cannot support anybody who comes over from Calderdale. We want that learner choice, but equally, we need to work out how we can help them to target the funding into the right areas.
Thanks. Conscious that my job as chair is to be totally apolitical and totally non-biased geographically as well, but Tyler is also from Kirklees, so I've got a bit of sympathy with him. However, I just wonder whether part of this, your answer, would have been to do with where the providers are based, as opposed to, I don't know whether it follows the person, so that might be why the higher rates appear to be in Leeds, because there are more of them, and people from other areas like Kirklees can go to Leeds for, I don't know, maybe that's part of the answer. I don't want to dwell on this, but if that's part of the reason, it might be skewing the figures.
Partly, and so participation is based on the learner's residency, though, not based on the place in which it is delivered. And part of it, I suppose, is that we are tasking to connect. We're tasking our providers to connect people into employment. Therefore, there can be a tendency for them to operate more into an urban centre where there are more opportunities. It is something, though, that we are addressing with them. One of the things that we've been looking at with all of our providers and our local authority colleagues is, I suppose, the proportionate engagement and how that looks against our disadvantaged areas. And we have identified some real cold spots where we can see a disadvantaged area and very little participation through the funds. So it is something certainly for year two in trying to tackle some of that geographic representation to make sure we are supporting those individuals.
Sorry, I was distracted. So, next question is from Councillor Winard. Jeff?
Thank you for the report, and it sounds positive, but when we look at the detail, the reality is that the adult education budget was lifted from the centre and plonked into the region as part of the devolution deal, 60-odd million pounds worth. Now, that suggests that the changes you've outlined are like marginal changes to, bearing in mind, I presume most of the 60-odd million pounds was already being, well, obviously was already being spent, but it was already being spent presumably on useful activities. So though clearly you've started the process of redirecting and trying to take into account local needs, the reality is lots of the stuff which was already being delivered, in a sense, we can't really stop delivering. And that in itself limits the potential flexibility you have. And linked to that, in terms of the providers, presumably there are continued ongoing quality assurance arrangements in place to ensure that those providers are providing things which work well and have good outputs. And I hear occasionally from people in the FE sector that quite a lot of courses are put on and then they're undersubscribed and they don't really become economically viable. I suppose those are the comments I would make.
Sorry, I haven't actually turned off my microphone there. Apologies if you got my loud typing. Absolutely, I think that's the point being made about this isn't new money to the area, but certainly what we can see through close management of the funding is we can start to identify maybe certain practices or certain courses that we can see achievement rates. So absolutely, we are watching the providers to understand the quality of their provision. We have plans to do more work on learner voice and really understand from the residents how much they've valued the programmes. We can also see their progression into employment or otherwise into further education. So we are able to look at those aspects and I suppose really manage that quality, and through that identify if there are elements of that 65 million that were being spent in the area before that we haven't been, that we might want to defund in order to provide some of the more economically active aspects. Another another point, another aspect of devolution is going from that 200 down to 38 providers. There's a lot of subcontracting in the system, so organisations based down in London would pay somebody to come and deliver some learning up in West Yorkshire. We've eradicated a lot of that and got rid of those management fees that were being wasted in the area. So again, that's created some money that we can invest more positively directly in learning rather than it being utilised in the system. But you're absolutely right. It is a careful balancing game of ensuring that we continue to fund the things that were happening. And I think if you look in the AUB strategy that Peter contributed to a huge amount to, it wasn't in a terrible shape before we took on devolution. And I think we should acknowledge that we do have, by and large, a responsible provider base, that we're connected to employers, that we're making the right training opportunities. Our job is to really focus in on that and make sure it's and amplify the positive aspects that were there, and help us make sure that we're also future gazing with the funds and really pointing it towards future vocational opportunities as well.
Thanks for that. The next one is Councillor Fenton, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. We're just beginning our devolution journey in York and North Yorkshire, so it'd be really useful to basically plagiarise some of the things you're doing and learn from your learning in your first year. So it'd be good to keep in touch. I noticed in the report there was a mention of an external review of community learning provision, and I think that's an area that is often overlooked, in that whilst some of that learning may not have a direct skills element in terms of training someone for a particular role in a particular industry, but in terms of introducing people back into the concept of learning, and in doing so improving numeracy literacy skills. So I suppose the question is, should we be concerned that there may be a sort of denigration of community learning, which might have the effect of stymieing some people's ability to access some of the directly skills related learning that, as we've heard earlier, we do need to support people into because of the gaps that exist in the local economy.
So I suppose the review is trying to understand exactly that. They really determine the impact that we're seeing, and again, we've been really. It's an independent review, and we've been really comforted is the wrong word. Actually, impressed by some of the case studies and the data that has been brought forward, particularly in terms of social return on investment from some of the providers that are delivering that. And we absolutely recognise the value that community learning has in terms of reaching out to those who are the most disadvantaged, and that really first step for people who are nowhere near ready to engage perhaps with employment or with education at this point, but do need support. However, I suppose we're also cognizant of the current Department for Education's approach to community learning, and some of the conversations being held there nationally. So I think it's quite timely for us to have commissioned that review to really understand what is happening on the ground, and I suppose come out in defence of the aspects that we're really proud of, and understand again where we might need to work with the provider base or consider how we shape our funding rules to make sure that I suppose that action towards inclusivity is exactly what the community learning funding is being targeted on. And we also learnt a lot from the other MCA colleagues that went before us for AEB, so we're really happy to have those conversations ongoing.
Thank you. Next question is from Councillor Brundell, Helen.
Thank you. A couple of questions which the answer to which is probably linked. Firstly, how much of the allocation is actually spent? Is there a figure for that, and is it in some areas significantly less than what is allocated and budgeted for? Secondly, I think most of the figures from 21-22 to 22-23 are roughly similar, an increase maybe a couple of thousand, couple of tens of thousands. There are some where there's been a significant increase or a significant drop. what are the factors looked into? Is that they're not spending the money the previous year? Is it that other services have come forward which could spend that money better or are covering the same areas? Thinking particularly, Think Employment Limited has seen kind of a 400 grand drop, and there's others which have seen several hundred grand rises. So just wondering kind of what factors are in play there. Thank you.
Thanks. So in terms of the overall allocation, and not to steal the highlights from the end of year report when it is published, we have utilised around £62 million. We're working on the very final details. So there is about 3 million, I suppose, are really of the allocation that wasn't spent. And you're absolutely right to, I suppose, spot that these are the allocations for providers. It's not necessarily what has been delivered on the ground. A really key point, because it is devolved, is that we keep hold of that funding and we can reinvest it in next year and in future years. Benchlining against some other MCAs for a first year of devolution, that's actually quite a conservative underspend value that we're going to be carrying forward. In terms of the changes of allocations, we opened up growth opportunities in years. So as part of the responsiveness funds that we kept back, part of that was about supporting providers who were engaging in the right areas, who were successful in engaging, and allowing them to increase their funding. So we had a number of metrics that the Employment and Skills Committee recommended that essentially allowed providers to grow their allocation in year. Where they were successful, we've continued that allocation moving forward. And again, through performance management, if a provider has significantly underperformed, generally we've had a sensible conversation with them about what a reasonable contract level is and the expectations of what they can utilise moving forward. Sometimes those conversations are a little bit more difficult, but it's all about us making sure that the funding is going to those providers who are best able to support our residents.
Thank you. And that takes us just about nicely onto the next agenda item. I would say that these two last agenda items about the adult education budget and the young people are really important to me, and I'm sure to the rest of this group, because I think we have to recognise that the people who are not in work need supporting to get into work, and that's not just the NEET people, it's the adults who might, for whatever reason, not have had the opportunity to get education at the time most of us did. So I think it's really important, and I think focusing on this stuff is really key. So thanks for that. 7D is, I'm not sure who's taking that one, Phil.
I am.
Is that you?
Oh, it's me, because the colleague that provided this is away today. So thank you for all the excellent questions and comments on the last item as well. I agree, this is something we probably to bring kind of at least as an annual kind of update to this committee. And this is obviously commenting on the first year. We've taken this on and delivered against it, and there are things we're learning and developing on this. So it's really important to have that challenge and support from this committee to help us do that. So this next item is about what we're doing with other parts of devolution and what we're planning to do. We have alongside kind of adult education budgets, we have a pot of resources around revenue and capital that has got to be linked to growth in our priorities over a 30-year period. And the leadership of the local authorities and the mayor decided to allocate over the next 3 years 21 million towards employment and skills. So this item is about what we're doing, what we're allocating there, and what we're doing to develop this. And this absolutely is based on evidence of all the issues we've spoke about today, actually. So the need to kind of have that flexibility to respond to the changing labour market, thinking about young people, thinking about the challenges around the labour market that Peter really kind of identified well, the kind of challenges around increased people over 50 with long-term health issues leaving the labour market and how we support them. And the first thing we brought through over that 21 million is over half of that budget, which is 12 million, which is developing a package for an employment support service. which is replaces something that's been funded by European money up until the end of this financial year, that supports, and it's largely funds people and delivery in local authorities, to support 7,700 people across the region, of all ages into work. So addressing some of those issues we've talked about earlier, and this builds on the evidence of previous employment hubs, which target around things around needs we talked about already, and also tries to kind of pivot some of the challenges we have now and some of the opportunities we have now in the labour market, particularly around digital. Peter talked about the growth in digital skills, and around the kind of equality and diversity, and how we kind of support people from a range of backgrounds and include people in that. So that's the focus of that is within that kind of programme. In terms of other things that we're looking at, in terms of development, as I said, the bulk of that money is going to go on that employment hub support. We're looking at green skills and jobs, recognising that as the economy changes, there's a huge demand for people, in terms of the construction sector, in terms of the automotive sector, to help businesses, to help organisations, to help houses kind of green and improve the efficiency. So we're kind of developing a pipeline of funding to develop kind of skills investment in that area. We have a digital skills plan, which we've developed with DCMS funding and with the private sector and with all your local authority partners, that really focuses on two kind of core areas, making it really simple. One of which is kind of that kind of social inclusion element of digital skills, because everyone needs digital skills to kind of participate in either the labour market or just in their daily lives, but also in the opportunity of higher level digital skills, which is a potential area of growth for this region. So West Yorkshire, actually, when you look at its level of digital skills, it's kind of on a par with Greater Manchester. We don't talk about it enough, but there's a huge potential there in terms of our kind of high level growth. We're looking at one of the issues that our small businesses have is large businesses tend to attract graduates, but small businesses really struggle to attract graduates because they don't have that brand. So we're thinking about having a kind of overarching programme that supports our SMEs to have graduates and potentially to have a wider conversation about kind of school leavers as well within that too, and kind of a number of programmes we're thinking about in terms of supporting young people, which Michelle is already talking about at length. So and then finally, we have a series of programmes at the moment that are European kind of funded, but that funding comes to an end, around working with our business community about how we support them with skills and make those links with skills, and that's something we hear about a lot from businesses. So we're thinking about using our gain share, how we might kind of replace that funding and what we do next. So this approach that we've developed, some of it's been decided, some of it we're still developing. In terms of the approach we've taken, we've tried to take quite a consultative approach. So we've really keen to listen to both the voice of learners and the voice of our business community. So we've built that in, and it's been developed by and with our Employment and Skills Committee as well, as working with all your local authority skills leads as well. So we've got a limited amount of money. It sounds like a lot of money, but a limited amount of money to kind of focus here. So we're trying to focus it on the best areas. I'm really keen to hear in the short time we have some of your views on kind of what we're doing here and suggestions.
This must be first. There's not a queue of hands. So I'll just make a comment then, Phil, in the absence of any questions. Does this sort of link to the point I keep going on about the link between employers and educational establishments, be that even apprenticeships, but FE colleges, universities? I keep saying that it's really important that the providers of these courses are in touch with. I know in my area in Kirklees, Huddersfield University is really good at this. And it's important that the business community and the universities and FE colleges and the other institutions are in tune with each other, because it's no good producing loads of people who, as soon as they qualify in whatever they've got as a chosen subject want to disappear off to the other end of the country. I mean, obviously there's a place for that, but we also need to retain some of this local talent so that we're not just training people and then they're disappearing off to work somewhere else. So does that sort of capture in here as well?
Thank you, Chair. I mean, this is kind of at the nub of why we should really have devolution, because we can have those conversations at a regional level better than you could have it at a national level. So we've got some excellent universities, Huddersfield being one of them, that have really good links to our local business community. But we need to kind of have that conversation about what are the needs of our business community as a whole, and working with our LEP board and partners on that. How they're going to evolve as well, because they don't stay still, and the needs change year on year. What are the views of our learners? How can we include our learners? And we're trying to have that conversation locally. There's a lot of interest in that conversation locally. I should mention at this point that the chambers of commerce have been kind of appointed as other chambers of commerce across the country to run something called the local. I'm going to get the acronym wrong, so Michelle, correct me if I've got it wrong. But the local skills improvement plan. Thank you. Which is also about working with the business community to understand skills needs as well. So we're wanting to work really closely with them on that too. So that you're absolutely right. That link with the business community and colleges and us as funders is critical, and we need to kind of keep talking to get that right. Particularly, and it doesn't stand still, so it evolves over time.
Yeah, the last point you're absolutely right about. I mean, I grew up in Holmfirth, which was massively textiles when I was a kid. I used to deliver papers to several mills, and they're all closed down now. But there are a few really high-end, very expensive textile manufacturers left dotted around the valley, and their requirements for staff is totally different to what it was when I was at school, because it's all ridiculously expensive, high-tech, stuff. So it's really important. So thanks for that. So I have a question with Tyler.
Cheers, Richard. An apology. I think this question comes from a place of ignorance on my part, really. But the Employment West Yorkshire, 12 million investment there for a universal personalised service to individuals to access the employment skills and training they need towards some progression into work. Has that not been done before? Is that not something? Is that a follow-on from something that's already existing? Are we reinventing the wheel? What is that a little bit? If you don't mind.
Two short answers. A, it's not an ignorant question. B, yes. But C, but we've tried to some critical things there. We've tried to, before it was kind of governed by kind of the European funding, which is quite prescriptive about what we could do. So we've used the opportunity of the gain share funding to have more freedom and some flexibilities in what we do. Take the learnings, and what we're keen to do is have some really good monitoring of what local authorities are doing, have some continuous improvement, and share best practice, challenge where we can, and also really try and push that point which relates to the last question from the chair around how we link kind of how the labour market's changing and how support needs to evolve. Noting the fact that you can't kind of turn skills around immediately, but kind of you can over a longer period of time.
Jeff.
I suppose my question again is on this theme of how we interact with business, businesses, and how we can actually really understand what their needs are. Because I think inevitably engagement with business is going to be dominated by the big employers. And clearly, as you alluded to on the graduate issue, there's an awful lot of small and medium-sized businesses who I sometimes wonder, particularly the smaller ones, are not really in the conversation. The conversation is dominated by the needs of the big employers, and I just wonder whether we can do more on that front. And by the other, just a particular bugbear of mine, we keep hearing about European funds. Those are funds where UK taxpayers' money is being mediated through Europe and coming back to the UK. I just want to clarify that point.
I think it'd be dangerous to comment on all of that, so I'm not going to. Just a few things there. We do have some of the things I referred to. So we do have something called Skills for Growth, which is completely targeted around having that conversation, with businesses, and that is kind of we have officers here that work very closely on a locality basis that try and do that. We also work. We had a meeting yesterday with all the different trade bodies, which includes the Federation of Small Businesses as well. So we're trying to kind of understand that. But you're absolutely right. We cannot possibly engage with every single small business about their needs, but we try in our approach to get the general sense of the direction of travel and the skills needs, which is, and we try and do that in the best way we can. And one of the other challenges I'll just say that we have is trying to get small businesses to think more about their skills needs as well, because they've got quite a lot on at the moment. Their focuses might be on some other things as well. So kind of that's partly what Skills for Growth is about too.
I mean, just as a quick follow-up for that, I mean, I understand the problem, but I think that sometimes some of the business groups, which necessarily, we have to speak to, aren't necessarily representative of the whole sector of which they represent, and I think that sometimes there are issues around that, but I don't expect you to say much more on that.
Thanks, all. I think it's probably time to go on to the next agenda item, which is, when I find my paper, it's just an information piece, so I don't think we need to discuss this as much as people would read it and suspect any comments by email, really.
So on that was our general kind of economic update. So that's for your information, but happy to take and kind of Sherpa any comments for you that you have on it kind of offline.
Thanks, Phil. I think that's the best way to proceed because we have to close the meeting in 5 minutes. And I would like to just discuss the work programme on agenda item 9. I'm not going to go through the full paper on here because it doesn't really give us anything other than what we've discussed before. But what I would like to do is just to discuss the next meeting. I think it's the January meeting, if I'm not mistaken. 18th of Jan, and this was the one where we had a blank for the agenda. Is that right, Hannah? See, I've not lost my marbles totally. So, what I have done, with a bit of help from my friend on my left, we've come up with a proposal for what we may discuss. And this is a proposal and nothing more. We were going to look at enterprise zones, which comprises of a brief overview of what that is, and a look at the 10 sites within the Leeds City region, understanding how the programme has been delivered and what projects within the programme, how they're comprised, and etc. etc. So I would like to hear comments, because you've all got an equal voice in this. If there's any other suggestions, and if we can't resolve this in 2 or 3 minutes, we'll resolve it by email after the meeting, but if there are any comments about either what I've just mentioned in terms of enterprise zones or alternative suggestions, I'm quite happy to hear them.
It's a really good topic to bring on to the next one. Alongside that, if we do have time, could we add the discussion with regards to careers as an item as well? I think that needs to be explored a little bit more further.
So careers, can we try and narrow that down a little bit, be a little bit more specific about exactly which part of careers we're talking about, just so that we can try and...
Young people, schools, careers talks at schools, how we're engaging, what's happening from now till... We've got to bear in mind in March we've got a meeting with the Mayor, so
Yep.
if we've got any questions arising from that, then we can put them to the Mayor.
Yep.
Yeah, to take them away and
Okay.
back to us with some more.
So I heard Hannah typing furiously on my left. I think you've got that. I think that's a good point because it builds on the conversation we had earlier today. And I think I also am thinking about the meeting with the Mayor in March. I don't think we can dedicate a huge amount of time to discuss that at the next meeting because we need to look at the things within the agenda. But I do think perhaps I will send an email probably just after Christmas that we can probably discuss the Mayor's meeting. The last one was probably a learning experience for me, if I'm honest. I think we need to probably improve upon that, but we'll not dwell on that now. Are there any other comments on what we've just discussed about the next meeting? Phil.
Just really, really quickly on the careers point, I think we probably, if we do something on that, whether it's that meeting or another meeting, I think we'd probably just be to clarify about what roles and responsibilities and powers the combined authority has versus the wider system, because we're obviously operating as part of a wider system in that. So I think that's an important point in that item.
I think that's a really good point, actually, and I think that's a really good point for everything we discuss in this room, because there's absolutely no point, and we do this all the time. I'm guilty of it, and we do it in our local authorities. I'm pretty sure we talk about things that interest us, but actually, what we should be doing is sticking to things that really are in the gift of this authority, in my opinion. Otherwise, we could spend all day talking about national politics. We'd all have a good old argument, but we wouldn't resolve anything. So, Tyler's smiling now. He knows we agree about some things. Right, cool. We're on 12 o'clock-ish, all bar a few seconds. So I'd like to thank you all. It was a really good session today. There's an awful lot of stuff we talked about, and to me, this stuff really matters, and it underpins the economy. So I think we have talked about things that really matter today. So thank you very much for contributions, and I will see you all next time.